Okay, brace yourself. Today we're talking about the keto diet. What's going on, everybody? Mark Green here, talking all things weight loss, fitness and healthy living. Now today we are talking about one of the most controversial topics in nutrition and diabetes, and that is the ketogenic diet. Now, before the avalanche of abuse that tends to come when anyone talks about this diet, we're going to be looking at both the pros and the cons of the diet, because there's always a good side and a bad side to any approach. Now, I'm so nervous about this, I've even put on a shirt. So we're going to try and give a nice balanced overall outlook about this approach for managing both your weight, your health, and also your diabetes. So let's look at some of the different things that come up, and hopefully it will be received very well. So let's go. What is a ketogenic diet? Okay, like all the videos, the first thing we need to do is define what we're talking about. So a ketogenic diet, otherwise known as a keto diet, is when you have very low levels of carbohydrates in your diet. And what this allows your body to do then is use up its glycogen and glucose stores from the liver, the kidneys, and just in circulation. But then because you haven't got any glucose in your body needs to do two things to compensate. One, it needs to make additional glucose from fat and protein via a process called gluconeogenesis. Don't worry too much about the fancy words, it's just a process where we're making glucose. That helps to fuel the central nervous system and the brain. However, you're not getting the optimal amount that your body requires, so the body picks up the slack using a different process. And this is a different pathway from fat metabolism, where your body breaks down the usual fatty acids for energy, but it also produces something called ketones, which can also act as a fuel source for the brain and the central nervous system. For those that are interested, I actually have a blog on the site all about ketosis and how that's generated. So if you're interested, take a look. And it could be an interesting watch for you. Now, everyone will produce some form of ketones, so actually it's quite a natural process. But as you reduce your carbohydrate intake and therefore your glucose supplies in your body needs to react, and therefore it upregulates the breakdown of fat, which is the basis of the diet, because if you're mobilizing fat and your fat stores, the theory is that you'll start to lose more weight. So that's the concept of the keto diet. To put this into practice on a day-to-day basis, it means people are primarily relying on protein-based foods like meat, fish, cheese, eggs, nuts, also spreads like butter and oils, and that kind of really makes up the bulk of the diet. It also means then that people have very small amounts of starch, if any at all actually. It means they generally have quite low levels of vegetables and fruits because they do contain some carbohydrates. And also, if you really want to be in ketosis, you can't be having any things like sweets, biscuits, chocolate, cakes, etc., because they're all loaded with sugar, which is turned into glucose in your body and therefore will kick you out of ketosis. Okay, good start. Let's keep going. Keto diet and weight loss. So the first thing the keto diet generally is used for is weight loss. I've just prompted myself here with some different notes. So, weight loss, what's the deal? Well, actually, there's not a great deal of evidence with studying keto diets in particular in the medical research. In fact, most research in nutrition isn't the highest quality because it's quite difficult to study. Generally, it's hard to get people to follow a certain approach for a number of years. And the problem with nutrition is it takes years before you really see the effects of that approach. Now, you can study weight loss to a certain extent, and most of the articles I found for weight loss were about 6 months in duration. Now, the problem is we know that people can go on any diet and lose weight for 6 months. What we're really interested in is what happens after a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Because it's all good losing weight for 6 months, but to get the health benefits of losing that weight, you need to keep it off. You need to keep it off lifelong, generally speaking. So from the studies that I did find, it actually, in fairness, the keto diet or very low carbohydrate diets do exert more weight loss. Now, it's not a huge amount, so on average, people that followed a keto diet lost around 5 kilograms over the period of 6 months. The second closest diet to that was your general Mediterranean diet, which is kind of the healthy eating guidelines in the UK. And the average weight loss there was 4 kilograms. So it depends which way you dress it up. You could say that it's only 1 kilogram difference, so it's not a huge amount, and actually over a longer duration they might chop and change. Or you could say that the difference is a 20% difference. I had to think about that then and actually count it up. In fact, you'll see the edit where I had to actually stop and think. Right, so yes, it looks like it's a good approach for weight loss in general, and actually people that go on it and sustain it swear by it. But really, is it the ketosis that's causing that? Or is it the fact that these people, I always say this in these videos, it's not these people in general, it's not these people in general, or people that are on the diet, or is it the fact that they have actually cut out a lot of major food groups from their diet? So starch, we tend to overeat anyway in this country and worldwide anyway. We eat an awful lot of rice, pasta, bread. You know, actually the recommendations of what we should be eating to what we do eat, it's just such an imbalance. So cutting out that food group entirely, you're going to massively drop or lower your calorie intake each day. What's the other thing you can't eat on this diet? Cakes, biscuits, sweets, chocolate, all those treats in the office. And it's quite a good diet in that sense because you actually test if you're in ketosis. And if you have too many carbohydrates, you'll come out of ketosis. So you know if you've overdone it. So it's almost like a little motivation to stay away from that stuff. But again, that's a bunch of foods that are not conducive to weight loss that you do by definition cut out on this diet. So one, it does kick you into gear and help continue with the weight loss. But on the flip side, there are two major food groups that can be significant contributors to your calorie intake that are gone. So is it the ketosis? I'd always argue that actually it's just the overall calorie reduction in your diet. The other thing that we also need to consider from a weight loss perspective is when people go on a diet, you go, generally speaking, from a state of not regulating your diet, not thinking about it, because by definition, if you're going on a diet, you need to lose some weight. So by going on the diet, you're coming from a position of not being on a diet, and therefore you're probably being a bit looser with it, to going on a diet, and therefore you're actually regulating your habits, your intake, your dietary behaviors. So even just doing that in any shape or form, you're probably going to lose a bit of weight. The other problem with diets is we tend to only hear about the success stories, and there are quite a few of them if you look on the internet. But that might be only a small sample. I know that I see a lot of patients and clients that do go on a keto diet and don't lose weight. And they can't understand why, because they're in ketosis and they think that that's a one-way ticket to weight loss. But it isn't necessarily. You still need to be in a negative energy balance in order to kickstart some weight loss. So you need to be eating less calories than your body needs. And a lot of the foods in a keto diet are actually very high calorie. Now, particularly if you're not someone that's exercising very much, it's still easy to overeat, regardless of the food groups that you're choosing. Right, so that's weight loss. Let's move on. Keto diets and diabetes. All right, so let's look at diabetes then. So we have a few different types of diabetes. We have type 2 diabetes, we have type 1 diabetes, and we have everything in between, but these are the two main ones that we're going to focus on. Now, in both diseases, or both conditions, it's carbohydrates in your diet have the potential to spike your glucose levels. So carbohydrates are turned into glucose, which is what essentially diabetes is. It's high glucose levels. Now, in type 2 diabetes, it's not just about the diet. It's also fat around the liver and around the pancreas that causes your blood glucose levels to rise in the first place. So treating that underlying cause through weight loss and physical activity actually helps normalize your blood glucose levels so you're able to tolerate these foods once again. But if you're not able to do that, then actually, yes, reducing the amount of carbohydrates in your diet will help lower your blood glucose levels. And actually, the research for keto diets, it does look quite clear that people that follow keto diets need less medication. So they might need less insulin, and they can also reduce the number of therapies that they're on, particularly the ones that initiate more insulin production, like sulfonylureas, or actually lower the doses of their insulin that they're taking. In type 1 diabetes, so this is slightly different about how this one comes about, as these patients do not produce any of their own insulin. It's still carbohydrates that increase their blood glucose levels, so they will need to take additional insulin injections whenever they eat a significant amount of carbohydrates. So by eating less carbohydrates, they need to take less injections. So once again, actually, people that go on to ketogenic diets from an anecdotal perspective, their glucose levels do tend to be quite stable. But it doesn't mean that everyone that eats carbohydrates suddenly has erratic glucose levels. I see a lot of patients that also have very stable glucose levels, despite the fact that they are eating carbohydrates. So let's look at the cons now. Now, the cons that I'm going to focus on are primarily in type 1 diabetes, but we'll make reference to type 2. So let's start with type 1. So type 1 diabetes, there is a condition that can manifest itself called diabetic ketoacidosis. Now, I won't bore you too much with the details, but let's just say it's bad times. And this happens when your body doesn't have enough insulin on board to control your blood glucose levels, so you start breaking down a vast number of ketones and they start to rise uncontrollably. Your body becomes very acidic, and essentially before we invented insulin, this led to death in these patients. So really bad times. Now, the problem with a keto diet is if you're running a baseline of ketones in your body, if you start to fall into a situation where your body's really increasing its keto levels, you haven't got enough insulin on board, you're sick, your body's stressed for whatever reason, it can tip you into that process much easier. The other thing as well is that if you're testing for ketones, then if you're following a diet that makes you produce ketones at a higher level than what you'd normally would, it can be difficult to recognize when it might become a problem. So it could mask when you're starting to produce ketones in a negative way as opposed just through dietary means. So I'd always suggest that people with type 1 diabetes, you can follow a low carbohydrate diet, but I wouldn't drop below that 50 grams per day to generate ketones as a baseline because it can just be dangerous. In type 2 diabetes, now it's not the same sort of thing because your bodies do produce some of their own insulin. So you tend to have a bit of protection with regards to ketones rising too high. One of the times that it can become a problem is if you're taking a medication called an SGLT2 inhibitor. Now these basically make you pee, so they can dehydrate you, and if you're starting to produce ketones and you become unwell, it can concentrate the ketones in your body because you're becoming dehydrated, and it can also push you into that diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA as we call it. And we've seen a number of patients in recent times come in with this. So if you're taking one of these medications, they end in gliflozin, dapagliflozin, canagliflozin, empagliflozin. If you're taking one of these and you're on a keto diet, my suggestion would be speak to your diabetes team to see if you can come off that medication or get out of ketosis and eat a little bit more than 50 grams per day because it can be dangerous. One of the other key drawbacks that we need to discuss with diabetes and keto diets is the hypo risk. Now, the first thing is actually just having a low carbohydrate diet can make your glucose levels run a little bit too tight so that you're susceptible to hypoglycemic episodes, particularly when you're doing other things that help lower your glucose levels like exercise. Also in type 2 diabetes, if you're taking the other medications other than insulin that lower blood glucose levels significantly, like sulfonylureas, you'll know these as things like gliclazide, they tend to end in zide or mide, typically speaking. These can also cause drops in your glucose levels. So if you're taking those medications and you decide to go on a keto diet, again, it's a really good idea to time with your diabetes team to explore your options. The other risk when it comes to hypos and diabetes is if you're following a keto diet, then you're exhausting your supplies of glycogen, which is stored glucose from your liver and your kidneys and your muscles. Now, usually when you experience a hypoglycemic episode, not only do you have to treat it with sugar and then do a follow-on treatment with some more slowly releasing carbohydrate, but your body would kick in and help get you out of it. So your liver would kick out a bunch of glucose to help combat that. But obviously, if you're running a base level of almost zero glucose stored in your body, then it can just exacerbate those hypos. So if you're someone that's prone to hypos in particular, a keto diet might not be the way to go, and actually just just having some carbohydrates in your diet might be a good idea just to mitigate against that hypo risk. Because although it's the highs that over a prolonged period lead to most of the complications in diabetes, it's the hypos that can get you in an instant and can be very dangerous, and also they're not without their long-term complications with regards to cognition, and links to dementia and things like Alzheimer's as well. So we're really keen to avoid hypos if we can. Keto diets and general health. So now we've looked at weight loss and diabetes, but what about general health? So this is things like mortality and cardiovascular events and people becoming acutely unwell. Now, one of the problems when we look at keto diets, particularly in the mainstream or on Twitter, is people will quote evidence saying this study found this and people lost much more weight with the keto diet, or they're in much better health. And actually, when we delve into the research, keto diets generally do reduce people's blood lipids, like their cholesterol, their LDL cholesterol, and their triglycerides. Now, usually it's because they're also losing weight simultaneously. So it's not necessarily the fat that's been driving that, it's the fact they're carrying too much fat. So not their dietary fat, their actual subcutaneous fat that they're carrying. So as they start to shift this, it reduces those numbers. But nonetheless, if that's a mechanism to reduce their overall body weight, then that's a good thing because it's putting them in good health. Now, as I said, when we're looking at the research to see whether or not any diet or any lifestyle approach is beneficial for health long term, we really want to see it over a number of years. And I've really only found a couple of studies that have looked on this scale. The first one didn't even look at keto diets, it looked at the other end of the spectrum, high carbohydrate diets. And they looked at 135,000 people from 18 countries over 7.4 years. Now, what the researchers found was people following higher carbohydrate diets had a higher incidence of mortality, so death, and also cardiovascular events, bad things. But again, cracks emerge as you start to delve a bit deeper, because actually the people studied were over lots of different countries and generally speaking were from a lower socio-economic background. So what they were doing was they were primarily relying on cheaper carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates. And there are two different types of carbohydrates. They're two different beasts. You have the refined type, which is like your white bread, white pasta, white rice, sugar, those types of things. And you also have your less refined, more nutritious side of things, which is more your whole grains, oats, cereals, certain types of potatoes, vegetables, fruits. These are the kind of good carbohydrates. So they are two different beasts. So actually I looked a little further and found another research study that was actually more recent and actually was much better put together. So let's take a look at that one. So this next study looked at 15,000 people over 25 years. And they looked at a broad spectrum again of people following all different types of diets across the carbohydrate spectrum. So very low amounts, so under 20% of their overall intake from carbohydrates, all the way up and beyond. To over 80%. So we've actually drawn this out here, what they found. So mortality here is on the left. I'll pull it up on the screen as well so you can see it. And as you can see, mortality was highest in people that followed very low carbohydrate containing diets. So this is the keto zone. They kind of hit a sweet spot around the 50%. And then as you get higher and higher, it can go either way. So it can reduce the risk or it can increase the risk. Now this is a classic example of people following highly processed carbohydrate diets that are cheap, and people that are actually eating a lot more vegetables and fruits and more nutritious carbohydrate containing foods. So we can see the differences. Now this is only one study, I get that. But we can see when we actually look longer term from one of the better studies put together, there might just be a sweet spot with this stuff. And we're not just talking about starchy food here. We're talking about all carbohydrate containing foods. So vegetables and fruits are included in this. Sorry, camera ran out of film time. Okay, we're back. Where was I? Yes, so talking about research. So here's the other thing then that I hear an awful lot, particularly on Twitter and in the media. They'll use research to prove their point. So they'll say keto diets are great, and they might very well be. I'm not saying they are and I'm not saying they're not. I'm just highlighting the pros and the cons. But you know, they'll choose a study that's maybe 4 months long and it had 5 people in it, maybe a bit more, 15 people in it. And they'll use that as good evidence to say this proved this. Now that's not proving anything. It's a very small sample that shows there may be some benefit. But in order to do that then we need, if you're going to use that study, then you need to use all the studies. And there are much more robust studies that have proven time and time again that fruits and vegetables and whole grains are good for health. They lower the incidence of diabetes, type 2 diabetes that is, cardiovascular disease, colon cancer, obesity, sleep apnea, and the list goes on and on and on. And it's usually when we're living somewhere around this 50% carbohydrate intake from all sources of carbohydrate. So when we're talking about that 5 a day from your fruits and your vegetables, the part they leave out of that message is minimum. So that's the minimum we should be aiming to achieve. The more the better. So actually when you start to see this graph trailing off and reducing the mortality risk below, so this would be 1 here, so I'll bring it up on the screen again. So you can see that 1 is the same risk as everyone else, and actually you can have less risk than everyone else when you start to eat more and more of these types of foods. Obviously I'm making a bit of an assumption that it's the fruits and vegetables and the good carbohydrates that are causing this, but generally speaking, when you're looking at all the different types of all the studies out there that I've read, it's getting quite clear that these things are good for you. That doesn't necessarily mean that high-fat keto diet, or if that's the sort of version that you're following, is bad for you. But just by definition, to be in ketosis, you cannot be having enough fruit and vegetables in your diet to mitigate against those other risks like colon cancer and bowel risks and things like that. Now, again, I'm not saying that means it's a one-way ticket to developing those conditions. What I'm saying is, when you have a diet that is plentiful in those types of foods, your risk is reduced significantly. So we can't ignore that research if we're going to use the other research to support other arguments. So we need to be balanced. Summary. I think we just need to appreciate there are pros and cons to every diet, really trying to understand the holistic view of this. I'm not, any diet has pros and cons, as does the keto diet. So hopefully that's given you a nice balanced view of this approach. At the risk of going on, I'm going to leave it there. So I hope you found this useful and interesting. If you did, make sure you hit the subscribe button and the like button if you're watching on YouTube. If you're watching on the blog, then by all means, if you need an extra helping hand, check out our programs and consultancy pages. We're working with people all the time to help them improve their health. So we'll leave it there, and I will see you at the next video, guys. See you later.